For more than 7 decades, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, Unrwa, has formed the backbone of Palestinian refugee camps, providing education, healthcare, and humanitarian assistance across Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Today, the agency is battling for its very survival. Israel has banned its operations. Key donors, including the United States, have withdrawn funding. More than 390 of its staff have been killed during the war on Gaza, making it the deadliest period in the organization's history. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has deteriorated sharply. UN officials have warned of famine, describing a situation in which food has been weaponized, while mass displacement continues and the prospect of a long-term political solution appears increasingly distant. Beyond Gaza, the West Bank and Lebanon, a larger question emerges. What if Unrwa, the agency created to support Palestinian refugees until a political solution is found, is dismantled? The campaign against Unrwa is not only about humanitarian aid or education, but about the future of the Palestinian refugee question itself. Will the right of return, enshrined in UN resolutions, be erased? The failure of member states to defend Unrwa has raised broader questions about the credibility of the United Nations system. To discuss this and what it means for the region and beyond, I'm joined by Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of Unrwa, who is stepping down after one of the most consequential and challenging periods in its history. Commissioner, many thanks for joining me and Middle East Eye. First question is about Israel's admission to the United Nations in 1949. It was predicated on its acceptance of a resolution 194, which was specifically about the Palestinian right of return. Now, it hasn't honoured that, and it's trying to dismantle UNRWA. Has it violated the terms of its own membership of the UN?
Well, the right of return is a final statute determination to be addressed through a political process. Now, it is true that I have said at many occasions that the attack on Unrwa aimed at stripping the Palestinians from their refugee status, and by doing so, also to undermine the future right of return of the Palestinian. It's a way to circumvent, in fact, the political negotiation, which should, at the end, settle this question.
But given the fact that it has never recognised this resolution, what would it take for the General Assembly or the Security Council to suspend or revoke Israel's membership?
Well, that's a determination to be done and to be made by the member state of the General Assembly. I know that this question from time to time pops up from some member states, but there haven't been any serious, I would say, action undertaken to answer this question, in fact, to the members of the General Assembly.
UNRWA is the only UN agency that recognises the Palestinian refugee question. Now, if UNRWA collapses, does the international legal status of Palestinian refugees disappear, or is this an Israeli or Ben-Gvir fantasy?
Now, this is definitely a shortcut, and it is completely false to believe that if the agency would collapse or be unable to provide the critical services that we are providing to the Palestinian refugees, that at the same time the status of the refugee would be dropped. But what's interesting is that most of the attack on the agency are undertaken under the belief that this would strip the Palestinians from the status. But this is completely wrong. Palestinian refugees, independently of whether yes or not the agency can continue to provide services, will keep their status, and the status basically will also go to the generation to come until there is a lasting political solution, or at least until there have been a durable solution being promoted.
Now, Unrwa was created by the General Assembly. If a member state can unilaterally ban or destroy or try to destroy a UN agency with impunity, what does this mean for the authority of the United Nations as a whole?
This is a question I have raised more than once. Basically, there have been a kind of lip service when it comes to the use or the reference to international law. Now, it is true that over the last few years, the agency has gone under massive attack. We had personnel killed, more than 390. We had premises being destroyed. We had massive disinformation campaign against the agency. We have legal cases, legislative bills which have been adopted to try to dismantle, in fact, the organization. We have become an objective also of the war. Unrwa has to disappear, whereas before October 7th, we were considered as a kind of a necessary evil because the reason of being of the agency was not recognized by Israel, but necessary because, on the other hand, they recognize the positive impact on security and human development of the Palestinian refugees. October 7 has changed everything, and basically we started to become a kind of unnecessary evil with the aim of making the organization disappear. So yes, there is a deep frustration, disappointment to see that an agency has been so blatantly crushed without real action from the other member states or the international community. This has gone, in a certain extent, with total impunity.
You say you were an objective. You mean you were targeted? Do you think Israel actually targeted? Is there evidence that Israel targeted UNRWA staff?
No, there is evidence that the dismantlement of the agency has become an objective. Right. We heard it from a number of leaders at the beginning of the war, but I have also to say that the author of the bills adopted against the agency do not hide the fact that the main reason is an opportunity in a generation, once for all, to address, and we come back to your initial question, the question of the refugee statue of the Palestinians.
The Kelowna report revealed that Israel confirmed your own evidence that Israel had received UNRWA staff lists for 13 years without raising a single concern until January 2024. In your view now, was the defunding campaign based on genuine political security concerns, or was it a political campaign?
The campaign against the agency is politically driven. I have absolutely no doubt about this. Of course, the campaign has used the pretext of a total infiltration by Hamas into the organization. But we have undertaken investigation for those who allegedly have participated to the massacre of October 7, and the conclusion came out in July 2024. In parallel, we had commissioned, in fact, this review by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, Catherine Colonna. We all know the conclusion. We have a system more robust than any other UN agencies, but because of the footprint of the footprint of the agency and the highly divisive environment in which we are operating, she shared 50 recommendations in 8 different areas where the agency could improve. We have embraced all these recommendations, and as of today, more than 80% now of the recommendations have been fully implemented.
11 staff members were fired out of a total of 13,000. That's sort of 0.07 of the whole organization. Is it fair to tarnish an organisation that big with the affiliations or actions of 11 members?
No, of course it is not fair. But the objective of the campaign was to undermine the support of the member states to the agency. And as you know, October 7 has reverberated far beyond Israel and in Palestine. Of course, it has been a shock in Israel, and the response to Gaza has been extraordinarily disproportionate, and it has also been a shock. But it has reverberated in the rest of the world. And this extraordinary polarizing context, divisive context, this division and polarization, we have seen it also in Europe, in the US, and in many, many other countries. So the campaign, of course, if you go in a polarized environment and you tell the politician that the agency has been fully infiltrated by extremist element, and you take this information as face value, it will undermine the support. So I agree with you. It is absolutely unfair. We had to debunk most of the allegation, but in terms of reputation, it has impacted the agency. You might remember that when the allegation came out, within less than 48 hours during the weekend, 16 donors have taken the temporary decision to freeze the support to the agency. Thanks to all the action we have taken, they all resumed, except the main one being the United States. But you cannot deprive millions of people of education and primary health and prevent 30,000 personnel to work across the region because you have an allegation of a few handfuls of staff who might have participated.
We know about Trump's attitude to Unrwa and the US generally. Has Britain, has the EU done enough? Have the Arab and Muslim countries done enough in terms of funding now? Can you just tell me about your thoughts about the funding of Unrwa?
Well, you know, the agency has gone over the last decade through a chronic underfunding. And when I started in 2020, I inherited an organization which already had a negative cash flow. A negative cash flow means that our expenses were higher than our income. It has nothing to do with a budget deficit, because a budget deficit is not necessarily committed, but a cash flow, it is committed. So before October 23, the main existential threat of the agency was of a financial nature. This total discrepancy and tension between what we are expected to deliver. We are an agency providing public-like services, education, public health, but we do not have the fiscal tool of a public institution or a government. We completely depend on voluntary contribution. So before October 23, we were a kind of collateral of the fact that the Israel-Palestinian conflict was not necessarily a priority. Other geopolitical priorities have emerged, so there was a kind of indifference. October 23 has accelerated the situation. In addition of the funding crisis the agency was experiencing, we started to have the political layer of the attack on the agency. Now, have member states done enough? Obviously not enough to protect the agency. Hence my alarm to the members of the General Assembly, telling them that if you do not pay more attention on the agency might not be viable anymore in the future. We cannot continue to navigate a constant chronic lack of resource, and at the same time seeing also our operational space shrinking because of political consideration. So we have to decide what we want. And I truly believe today that the agency can be considered as a valuable asset thanks to its workforce, expertise, community trust to make any future peace plan, and there is one now on Gaza, a success. If we are considered as part of the solution by ensuring a continuous access to critical services, in that case, the political will can be translated into resources. But today, the resources are not here. The US has stopped. Another important donor has stopped, being Sweden. It was part of the top 5. And we have also seen over the last year a significant decrease of the Arab world contribution to the agency. If you compare 25 with 24 we had a peak of support, but in 25 it dropped again down by 90%.
On the question of genocide, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry concluded that Israel had committed genocide in Gaza. Does Unrwa agree with the UN report that this was a genocide, not just ethnic cleansing? And how does this legal impact affect your operations?
Well, the legal determination will be made through a ruling of the International Court of Justice. But meanwhile, there have been a number of entities, bodies, the Commission of Inquiries, as you say, but also number of human rights NGOs, including Israeli NGOs, number of scholars and eminent experts who have described it as being a genocide. Now, clearly, an agency like Unrwa, which is a human development organization, has no say or about how to describe it. But over the last 2 years, I have constantly drawn the attention about the systematic atrocities which have been committed in Gaza. We have even highlighted some genocidal behavior against the population. But I think the question of whether it is a genocide or not, let's leave it for the time being in the debate among the scholars and the organization. Ultimately, the determination will be coming from the International Court of Justice, and this is the reference which matters.
You yourself said that food has been weaponized, and it described it as a man-made famine. Under international law, using starvation as a weapon of war is a war crime. Who bears responsibility for that?
I kept saying that the unfolding starvation, deepening hunger, famine was man-made, and that to address it, you need a political will and a political decision. But it is true that this has been inflicted as an additional layer of pressure exerted against the population in Gaza. Before the quasi-total ceiling of the crushing, especially between 24 and 25, Gazans have already experienced total destruction, constant forced displacement. They were moving like pinballs. It was not rare to find a person having said that in 1 year they had to move at least 10 times because there is absolutely no safe space. And in addition of that, yes, food has been weaponized, and a siege has been imposed, and a complete artificial famine has been, designed. Gaza, it's not a place where people traditionally experience food insecurity. They experience food insecurity only when it is imposed on them. So I believe that this was definitely a stain in our collective conscience because we saw it unfolding. The warnings were here, and it ended up all of a sudden with a nutritional and food expert declaring famine for 500,000 people living in Gaza. It's absolutely disgraceful.
What do you think of the, I would say, murderous attempts at food distribution? A number of people have been killed, shot at these food distribution points, and also the whole way of mass displacement towards Rafah and the designated aid clusters. Are we witnessing a second Nakba?
I wrote about this in an editorial in the Los Angeles Times, warning that if action is not taken, that might be a second Nakba for the Palestinian. Now you're referring to this so-called food distribution side put in place by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I have described it as a death trap. It's a total abomination. It has been put in place to replace, in fact, an existing functioning distribution system of the international community. At the time, agencies were active and operational. There was more than 300 distribution sites, and basically food was brought where people were, where they were in need, whereas it has been replaced by a system bringing down the 300 sites to only 4 distribution centers, which means that somehow, and the location was just nearby military position, which means that this site were also used to force people to leave and to support, in fact, military and political objectives. So this site have been total abomination. Nearly 2,000 people have been killed, more have been injured. Unfortunately, they finally have been shut down. What's ironic in this is that this was put in place under the pretext that the previous humanitarian system was encouraging diversion of aid. But in fact, diversion has never really been proven, and whenever it was proven, it was so anecdotal that it's definitely not a system. It was definitely not a system, and fortunately, they have realized that we have to go back to the system which prevailed before. But this experience has been a shocking experience, no doubt.
Can you tell us what's happening? How many aid trucks have actually got through Rafah since the ceasefire?
I think when the ceasefire was agreed, which, by the way, it's a ceasefire by name for the time being, because you still have people killed on an almost daily basis because of a military operation. They were talking about at least 800 trucks a day. There was commercial, but also humanitarian. But when the war in Iran started and spread in the region, that's when the number of trucks entering into Gaza started to decrease. I know that there are some UN agencies warning today that if we do not pay sufficient attention, we might go back to a food crisis similar to the one which prevailed before the ceasefire.
But how many trucks are actually getting in? It's nothing like 800. You don't know.
The short answer is definitely not enough. It's not commensurate to the need of the population.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And what is happening inside Gaza itself to the many people who work very, very bravely for Unrwa? Are they still functioning? Can you tell me anything about what's actually happening inside Gaza?
Yeah, against all odds, we are still the main provider of public health. And when I say public health, it's primary health consultation. We provide between 15,000 and 20,000 primary health consultations every day. Our colleagues are also involved in vaccination campaign. They're providing, ensuring also access to clean water. We have teams doing waste management to avoid the spread of communicable disease. And we're also focusing our priorities on resuming some form of education to bring back children in a learning environment. Today we have between 60,000 and 70,000 people back in person in a learning environment, but we are also providing e-learning, distance learning to more than 250,000 children. So today the agency is clearly focusing on its education and public health services.
So despite a law in the Knesset banning Unrwa still exists in Gaza.
We have to understand the law. That there is two laws. A third decision was taken amending one of the two laws. One prevents any presence of Unrwa in the sovereign state of Israel. And as you know, Israel consider occupied East Jerusalem as being part of the sovereign state of Israel, which means one law is directly impacting the presence in East Jerusalem. And you have even seen the images a few weeks ago of our main headquarters in Shavara being stormed, demolished, put in fire with officials from the government and the parliament expressing jubilation and almost disputing to find out who should take credit for that. So a certain expression of fight. Now, there is a second law which prevents any contact between Israeli officials and Unrwa officials. And this law means that we do not have administrative bureaucratic relation with the state of Israel. And the first impact was the phasing out of our international staff, both in the West Bank, but also in Gaza, because there is no visa being processed anymore. And the other constraint in Gaza is that no Unrwa convoys are being processed or cleared. We have 11,500 staff in Gaza. They are teachers, nurses, doctors, engineers. It's a manpower. So, the law does not prevent them to provide primary health consultation. We'll continue to do this. In fact, the main strength of the agency is its staff and the know-how and the expertise of our staff. Providing education does not require convoys coming into Gaza. We need expertise, and this expertise is with the population because our staff comes from the population. We are part of the social fabric.
Israel has a sort of replacement strategy by saying we will accept UN agencies like the WFP or UNICEF. Is UNRWA getting enough support from the rest of the UN? To try and stop that and prevent it?
Israel is telling member states that Unrwa has already been replaced. So you have sometimes member states are asking, but are you still operational in Gaza? So clearly we need to put more effort to communicate on what we are still able to deliver in Gaza. And that's exactly also what I did in my letter to the General Assembly last week, reminding, in fact, this power expertise and so on. I'm also calling on member states to safeguard the operation space and make sure that we reconsider as an asset for the success of any future plan. Now, Israel wants countries to believe that we have phased out, because they look at through the narrow lens of food distribution. It is true that Unrwa was a food supplier to the Palestinian refugees, but this is not the core of what Unrwa is all about. We are primarily, when it comes to services, a human development organization. We should focus on public health or education. Food is only when there is an emergency. But the UN in general has a World Food Program. So the World Food Program has slowly but surely taken over these activities. But it still does not mean that Unrwa has been replaced. Far from that. There is no other UN agency which is geared to provide public-like services. Yes, UNICEF can support education NGOs or an education ministry, but UNICEF does not have the resource, is not accredited, does not have the mandate to ensure the education, so the entire education of primary and secondary cycle of hundreds of thousands girls and boys in Gaza. So we can be replaced. I keep saying we can be replaced, but we can be replaced only by functioning empower Palestinian public institution, and hence you need to focus on that in order to allow the agency after that to have a durable, proper recipient.
I've been in countless refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, all over the place, where Unrwa forms the backbone of those camps and schools. It's the beating heart of these camps. Can you summarize the impact and the importance of Unrwa to the region as a whole?
I think the strength of the agency and the contribution of the agency to the prosperity of the region is education. It's extraordinary when you travel across the region, but even abroad, the number of Palestinians you will encounter telling you that I also went in a Unrwa school. And without the Unrwa school, I would never be where I am. Even today in Geneva, representative of the Palestinian embassy were telling the other member states, I come from an Unrwa school. If I would not have been in an Unrwa school, I would never be sitting in this room today. And I think this is a most extraordinary contribution the agency has. Now, we have to be very cautious, and we have to redouble our effort to make sure that education remains an asset that we cannot take away from the Palestinian. The Palestinian have been taken away their land, their house, but have always expressed pride in education, because they know that education is also the key for a better future. And today, the risk is in Gaza that we might lose an entire generation. But even across the region, if the agency continues to be weakened, it will also impact the quality of our education. And I do believe this would be terrible for the future with cohesion among the Palestinians.
I mean, even in a time of peace, the relationship between Palestinian camps and the host countries is really quite tense because of all sorts of restrictions on employment, restrictions on building, restrictions on access to healthcare. What is your view about the relationship? And now that's been overtaken by this whole question of disarmament in the camps. What's your view about the relationship between Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon to the Palestinian refugee camps?
I think it completely differs from one country to another country. What you are mentioning, in fact, refers primarily to Lebanon. In Lebanon, Palestinians have very restricted access to the job market, have almost no access to to land and property, but that is not the case in Jordan, or it's not the case also in Syria. In each country, the relation is of a different nature, but the most difficult one, the most discriminatory one, is indeed in Lebanon. Now, having said that, what brings all the host country together when it comes to Unrwa is their firm, I would say, objection to see the agency being further weakened. I understand it's important. We have the support. They're very good advocate for the agency, but sometimes the provision of services, including, and I gave an example of the waste management, even waste management in a camp can be seen through the lens through a political lens of intent to weaken the future right of return or aspiration of the Palestinian refugees. And I think it is important now, today, that we start to disentangle the question of the provision of services with the question of the future right of the Palestinian refugees, because if we succeed to do this, we can also have a healthier conversation about what the future of the agency will be all about.
In Lebanon, is Israel trying to apply the same tactics to Palestinian camps as it's done it to Gaza?
That's what we hear, at least and amplified in the media. That was stated by some members of the government. It's a chilling prospect. But there are some indication that the level of destruction and systematic destruction we have observed, at least in some villages in South Lebanon, are similar or have similar pattern than the systematic destruction we have seen in Gaza.
There have been reports talking about education. I mean, Israel has consistently claimed, without much evidence, that the curriculum in Unrwa schools supports terrorism. And there have been reports that Unrwa has changed the curriculum. Is it bowing to that pressure? Have there been curriculum changes? Or can you assure us that actually you're doing the right thing and sticking to your guns?
Let's be clear. The curriculum belongs to the host country. So there is no say from Unrwa about curriculum. Now, we use material in our schools, which also is provided most of the time by the host country. The material we use needs to be in line with a UNESCO standard. We are a United Nations organization, so we will apply the United Nations standard. Now, we are going through all the books which are provided to the agency and look at their compatibility. And we are looking at the number of criteria. One criteria is a gender-based criteria, age appropriateness also, and of course we have also the criteria related to does it yes or not promote, glorify violence or anti-Semitism or terrorism or whatever. I mean, that's an important angle too. The bulk of the problem are related to age appropriateness or even the gender bias. And whenever we are confronted to a problem about does it yes or not promote hatred, we will have to look at can this be put into context, number one, and if not, if indeed it can be perceived as glorification of violence, we will clearly ask that this is not a material to be taught in our school. So there the polemic, let's be also clear, is only in a very handful, 1 or 2 or 3 books. The examples are always the same. They have been addressed for many, many years. But it is true that one decision I have taken has been to ask that I think there was a case of a possible perception of glorification of a violence for which we have said that it does not bring anything when it comes to meet the criteria of the curriculum. It's totally unnecessary, and depending on the perspective, it can indeed be perceived that way. We are a UN school with UNESCO standard. We have to take this away. So we haven't modified curriculum at all.
And you haven't rewritten Palestinian history, because that's the most important.
Definitely not. And on this, we have always been very clear. There is a Palestinian narrative. There is an Israeli narrative. Obviously, they cannot be reconciled as long as the conflict is not resolved. And even if the conflict is resolved, it might take decades, if not centuries, until you reconcile the narrative. It's not our role. In the contrary, we have to preserve the narrative when we teach to Palestinian with a Palestinian curriculum. Here, we're not talking about narrative. We are really talking about a situational example, which would be contrary to the spirit of what the UN and UNESCO believe should be taught in schools.
One thing that I know, and I'm sure you know as well, is that you're very, very aware, we are both very, very aware of what happens in all the other parts of the conflict when all the eyes of the world are on Gaza. And you have said that over 1,000 people have been killed in the West Bank. Is the world so distracted by Gaza that it's ignoring the de facto annexation of the West Bank?
You know, unfortunately, you have always situations which are being overshadowed by other contexts. Right now, Gaza is also overshadowed by the war in Iran. But it is true that when we go back to the West Bank, it has, a kind of a silence war has unfolded under our eyes. Settlement have accelerated. Settler violence has gone totally unleashed with total impunity. There have been extensive displacement of Palestinians, the largest since 1967. There have been also pieces of legislation which have been adapted, allowing even more land grabbing beyond Area C. What we are witnessing in the West Bank is indeed a de facto annexation.
What do you think about international law, the application of international law? Because the ICJ has ruled that these settlements are completely illegal. And are bodies like the ICJ now completely powerless?
You know, what has changed is everybody used to keep saying that we are abiding to international law, and no one really liked to be finger pointed out. So you always find legal argument to explain why your action is in line or not in line. But in Gaza, what we have seen is that people are not even hiding anymore. They're almost claiming, they are openly expressing disdain and disregard for international law. And this is certainly one of the biggest frustrations. And we have to be careful, because there have been a belief that things can unfold in Gaza in total isolation, like a bubble, without repercussion elsewhere. But this is completely wrong. People thought this also at the beginning when Unrwa was attacked and crushed and so. But what we have seen is that other agencies after that started to experience similar situation. International NGOs We have seen journalists, aid workers also being dealt the same way. And today it's not only Gaza, we see it in Lebanon. And, there is nothing which can be just an exception. An exception becomes a precedent. And the risk is that the precedent after that normalizes this disregard of, in that case, of international.
This is your last day at Unrwa. Are you leaving it in safe hands? Can Unrwa survive, or is it under existential attack? Just bearing in mind everything that's happened to you over the last 3 years.
Well, first, we have a very seasoned UN person stepping in, the same Christian Sanders, the same person who made did the interim between the previous administration and the administration under my tenure. Now, the future will very much depend on, can we, yes or not, safeguard the operational space? Will member state stand up to protect the agency and to make sure that the agency play its part in any future, I would say, political process? I truly believe that we are an asset for the agreed reconstruction and recovery pathway of Gaza, but we need for that member state also to see that the agency is part of a solution. And I think also it's the only way for the agency to retrieve its temporary nature. You started it by reminding that, UNRWA is a temporary agency. It has been lasting for too long. So if there is a genuine commitment to promote a lasting solution, I do believe that there is a space for UNRWA to play its part and retrieve this temporary nature until we have a proper recipient to whom to hand over our services.
A Palestinian government.
And that would be a Palestinian government, absolutely.
I mean, we in the West, and particularly in Europe, tend to confuse the world's opinion with our own opinion. But I find that policy making in the global South so much more refreshing than what's going on in Europe, in Britain, France, or indeed America. Do you have optimism when you see what the global South is doing in relation to this conflict?
Well, I mean, the global South today seems to be more consistent as a stark defender of the international rule-based order. Of course, there are institutions which needs to be reformed to give proper space to the global South. I think the most obvious discussions are related to governance model, including Security Council, which is a open-ended, I would say, reform discussion. But the global South has a point here. I was also, in my interaction, surprised to see how partners in the global South were, I would say, taken back by the how to say this, lack of consistency of the Western Hemisphere in its implementation of, human rights declaration, even the UN Charter, this kind of, through gears way of interpreting. When Gaza started, there was a very deep anger in the region where people were saying, but how come that international humanitarian law applies everywhere except here? or does apply so strongly in this context, but it's completely ignored here? How come that impunity is not tolerated, rightly so, in a given context? And here you seem to have, blanket authorization, which seems to accept the idea that there is no red lines and that the war can be conducted without reference to the rule of the war.
Geneva Convention. Yeah.
The Geneva Convention is a good example, absolutely.
Commissioner, thank you so much. That was an excellent interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.